Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 60 of IGEL Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got, we'll start with Patrick. Patrick Toner is a solutions architect at XenTegra and our subject matter expert on all things end-user compute minus Windows. IGEL specifically is where Patrick's passion and background is. Patrick, how's it going?
Going good. Yeah. I do like to wear that banner of no Windows. So that's definitely not my thing. I do prefer Linux for sure, but doing good here.
So Patrick, not no Windows because you hate Microsoft, but just no Windows because in the real digital workspace world, you don't need Windows, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, I think it just comes down to kind of my history with end user compute. Oh, my daughter's behind me here. Oh, hey, how you doing? There was a point in time where I was at a job and we were trying to put actually Linux endpoints. We were trying to figure out a way to deploy Ubuntu to a small form factor device. And because of a lot of the reasons people choose IGEL today, right? Security, not all the bloatware and having to deal with, patching patching the endpoints with Windows updates and bloated updates and one update breaking everything. I mean, there's just all the things that people struggle with. And the one thing we couldn't figure out was a good way to manage it. And that was before I knew what IGEL was. So I've always loved Linux, just something, even, around the house projects, things like that, setting up a NAS server, those types of things. So I guess it's just funny how when you look back, how it culminates into what you're doing today professionally.
Yeah. Well, Seb's with us. Sebastien Perusat. Seb is our bi-weekly superstar guest host. Seb, I don't know if we've ever taught this, but what's your Linux journey? Did you just start from day one in a Linux world, or were you a Windows guy that found Linux and decided that was your future?
A mix of both answers, I would say. So, hi to all listeners. Now, I started basically with Windows 3.11. That was my first installation. Just before that, I had DOS 6.22. That's where my journey started. So I was definitely more on the Microsoft side at that moment. But a couple of years later, so I was, 5 or 6, something like that. And then a couple of years later, I installed my first Red Hat Linux. It was when I was 11, I guess. But it was just for playing around and testing some things. And to be honest, I used it a couple of times, but it was just, gathering some feelings on that topic. Mm-hmm. And then for, I would say, more or less 15 to 20 years, I was more or less in the Windows world, since we had Windows endpoints, we had Windows endpoints from IGEL. In former times, we had XP embedded, we had NT4 embedded devices from IGEL. Long time ago, please forget that once. And I started really to use and to configure Linux on an endpoint, not speaking about the server operating systems, when I started my journey at IGEL, so about 8 years ago. Before that, I was more or less a Windows guy.
Yeah, I think that's probably kind of common, even though I don't know many people start with Linux at 11 years old. But I think a lot of people, find Windows and is able to install it and play with it and use it every day. And then at some point they get curious about maybe Unix, which is my story, which then turned into Linux and, converting an old computer into a Red Hat client OS version of Linux, and then doing things like installing all the app packs and RDP, RPMs, right? RPM, and then using that to remote into a Windows box to get other things done. But so that kind of ties us into today's topic. You've put together a video, and the title is IGEL OS Command Line Explained. And I think this is interesting. I'm going to try to tie us back to the old days and then bring us forward. And by back to the old days, I think really even currently, if I'm using a Linux distro today, I am choosing a shell somewhere along the way, either Korn or Bash or something. And that is really the core underlying connectivity into the kernel and other parts of the operating system. In IGEL terms, we're calling that the command line. Is it really a shell, or is it a command line that talks to a shell? What are we really talking about when you say CLI, command line interface is what that acronym stands for? In IGEL world, are we talking about a shell, or are we talking about a command line talking to a shell?
No, we do definitely speak about a shell. So we have different environments integrated from shell, bash, dash, etc. But just to come back to your second question, we have also covered in that tutorial how to access the command line from a remote perspective. So using SSH or the secure terminal. And that's why I'm coming back to your statement. We have also a system which is going over telnet with a secure terminal, which connect then to the shell. So basically both answers are right. But for most listeners of our podcast, I would say that this level under the iceberg, so under the sea, is something that you don't need to use such often. So just wanted to say that even if you're using IGEL for a long, long time, you have maybe never had to get in touch with the command line. That's a great thing. I mean, even if I like to go on that under the sea level, for the standard user, for the standard administrator, there is no need to understand, to know how Linux is working.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to have some fun, in my opinion, then yes, because since we are covering an operating system which is read-only, which is covered by a security mechanism with signatures, encryption, and so on, we are obviously restricting the amount of fun inside of the operating system to a strict minimum.
Yeah.
If you know how to deal with it, you can use it.
So if you're Seb, you're doing it for fun. If you're the normal administrator, you're doing it out of necessity or maybe fun. Or maybe you do it out of necessity and figure out, hey, this is pretty cool. And for the Windows guys, this is really, we had DOS, which was command line single user stuff back in the day. And then we had Windows. And then with Windows, we had the command line, command, interpreter. And then at some point, PowerShell shows up and all of a sudden, Windows actually became a shell operating system, multi-user with a UI that talked to PowerShell in order to do things, more in depth, the way Linux and Unix has been from day one. I'll highlight here, you've got some slides that you go through before you jump into the actual demonstration. And the things you call out is why going to the CLI, why going to the command line in the IGEL world. And number one was execute commands. Number two, gather logs, debugging, scripting, customizing. And then for your benefit, I'll say just to have fun as the last one.
That's exactly right. Because the customizing part is that's where you get some fun. Debugging and gathering logs is not such an exciting topic, to be honest. Mm-hmm. But the customizing and scripting part is definitely something which can enable you to deploy on themes to make the IGEL OS operating system looking like a Mac OS.
Yeah.
Or if you want to get specific applications on your desktop, since you already covered the custom partition topic with Ronair a couple of weeks ago, that's also the part where you have to go into the command line because you have to execute some stuff. And that's where the fun starts, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try to do this and I'll hand it to Patrick for a minute. But locally, you have a UI, that's the setup application. You have a very similar UI in the UMS. Both of those things have the ability to interact with the local machine's registry. You guys actually even call it a registry. And then if you need to do things above and beyond that aren't available through those UIs and the registry, that's where custom commands can kick in, either real time or scripted and scheduled. And then that's where the fun and what you thought was the impossible becomes the possible, probably.
Yeah. Exactly explained why we should go to the command line. So, I mean, gathering logs is something that you can also do via the graphical user interface. You can also change a lot of configurations via the profile and the local setup, as you already mentioned. But it's just the upper part of the iceberg. So we have, just because you mentioned the term registry, so we have over 8,000 settings that you can set. If you would put all that settings into the graphical user interface, so on the upper side of the iceberg of the IGEL setup, it will just make it extremely, extremely hard to read. Yeah. And that's where we said, okay, we use a registry where there you have everything that you need. And if you want to point out a specific configuration, go there. And that's basically the same with the configuration of the UI. We have the iceberg, and then beneath the sea, we have all the command line where you can execute some funny stuff.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was working on my my Google Nest doorbell last night, not Ring, but Nest doorbell. And it had all these UI, all these settings. And it turned out to be this one really obscure setting that really didn't look like it had anything to do with the reason why my doorbell inside wasn't ringing. And I got lucky and found a video. I thought at some point I was going to have to get somehow lower, and maybe you can't, like in a mobile app, you can't get lower, but in a PC related scenario, Linux, Windows, at least, maybe, and even Mac, you can get lower into a command line thing. Oh, so Patrick, you've been doing this for a bunch of years now, let's say 5+ years on the IGEL side. And you're a very, very advanced IGEL administrator and consultant at this point. How often do you find yourself having to go to the command line?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because I was gonna chime in and say, and just kind of give a little context here. I do find myself in the command line, not so much in IGEL very frequently. I mean, that's kind of every now and then you'll have to do something via script and you put it into a profile. But I just wanted to point out, because sometimes people can get a little intimidated by Linux, right? Because most of us came up in a Windows world, right? So if you're in IT, you're some kind of whether sysadmin and whatever, your day to day, you're usually managing things in Windows, and so a lot of us will dabble with different hobbies. That's how I really got started. Like I mentioned, I mean, just doing random. I mean, there were some work reasons to get into Linux, like Fog back in the day, which is like a Linux imaging system, which is cool. But most of us are hobbyists. You mentioned the Google Nest. I was talking about a NAS earlier. What I would like to just kind of say is like a preface to this is like me getting into Linux was gradual, right? It was something that the more I would dip the toe a little bit, I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. So I would just say to anybody who's listening to this, who's like, even if they're an IGEL user, they don't know anything about Linux scripting. I would encourage you to find something. Find a reason to start to get familiar with Linux command line, because there was a scenario, and I'll just kind of answer your question. It's a little bit long-winded, but there's a scenario where I had to manage one of our IGEL Cloud Gateway servers here at XenTegra, and I was trying to do it from a Windows device, and I've just gotten so used to doing it via the command line in Ubuntu that I was like, you know what? I had to take one of my LG Grand laptops, throw Ubuntu down on it, and do everything via the command line there, because you get so used to it. So I'd say that as an encouragement to anybody listening who's like, I don't know if this is for me. Find a reason to get into to Linux. Take some Linux training. You will absolutely become hooked on it once you start to kind of understand the basics. And in my case, someone who's learned it gradually through time, I was like, I can't do this on Windows. I need a Linux distro right now to do my job. So yeah. And
not only that, but you'll be the coolest kid of your friends if you can do it all, even in Windows. If you can do it PowerShell, whatever shell you're using, if you can do it there. All of a sudden, stuff that other people don't. And even though they probably could if they just tried. Hey, real quick comments. I do want to highlight, and this was a struggle for me in the beginning. There is the concept of shell and command line stuff. And if you can do things at a shell level, then you can then turn around and script it. I think even in this call, we've transposed and used them in conjunction with each other as if it was the same thing. There's command line activities and actions, and if you can do it from a command line, you can then script it into something that is even schedulable or automatable.
Or even the graphical user interface. That's exactly right. That's where I encourage everyone, as soon as you can, as soon as you have resources and the devices are back on market, just buy a Raspberry Pi. It's not an extremely expensive device. Just put a Raspbian on it and try to find a great project that you would like to cover. I know from David Prowse from the community that he is covering a door opener with him for the garage. I'm using it for web filtering and some small servers and the Nextcloud server. So there is so much different use cases where you can go through the graphical user interface, but somewhere it ends, and then you have to edit some configuration files or restart some services. And then you will find yourself going to the command line quite automatically without having even the need to think about it. Yeah. So, and just one thing that I want to mention on IGEL OS, even if you break something, you will never break the device forever if you go to command line. So you can still reimage the device by using OSC. That would really be the worst case. But if you change something on a partition which is not /WFS, just be clear that everything can be reset to factory default and everything can be back online in a couple of seconds. So there's no really big deal on it.
Yeah. So Seb, I hit play on the video. What are you doing after we've done the intro here? What's the first thing you're doing in the video you recorded as part of this kind of getting to know the CLI?
If my memory is not leaking, I would say that the first stuff was that I create a session to access a terminal from the graphical user interface. Mm-hmm. So we are still looking at the Universal Management Suite, also known as UMS, where we are deploying profile to the endpoint. everything that I'm telling now can also be done locally in the IGEL setup. So if someone is asking me how can I access a terminal in an easy way, we have two ways. The first one is just to create a profile, go to accessories, terminal, and add a session. You don't have to configure some password or whatever. Just click on plus, save, assign the profile, and you will see a terminal window, which is a small black symbol on the desktop that you can double click and which will enable you to access the terminal.
And Seb, that's a good thing to highlight. Terminal access is not available on IGEL because the UI is limited on purpose.
Exactly. So we have the ability to access the terminal in a standard way via another way, which is covered a little bit later on, if I remember right. But from the standard point of view, not from the graphical user interface. Obviously, we don't want a user to execute something. And since if you start the endpoint for the first time and you just go through the first one without connecting to some UMS, there is no administrator password set. And in IGEL words, that mean that you do not have a root password set. It's not a big deal. If something is broken, reset to factory defaults, all good. But if you want to avoid that, set an administrator password, and it will also set the root password that you'll see now on the screen, which is basically I would call it the super user of the operating system. So the root user can more or less do everything that standard user can't do, even if he's in the command line.
Seb, quick question for you. The things that you do here at the command line, IGEL being a read-only operating system, do these things stick? The things that we do in the command line, is there something special about them?
You mean from the command that we're using, or?
Well, I guess I'm kind of thinking through it and answering my own question. I mean, it's just like anything else. You're doing things, actions. Are you also setting things, and are those settings stored in the registry of the persistence of this thing?
Yeah, you could. We have in the IGEL OS operating system sheet created in the community, we have the commands which are described there, which is set params, set user params, set group values, which you can use to also configure the local operating system via command line. So that's what is done behind the scene as soon as you assign a profile. And that's where you can configure, you can also change, you can delete settings, but you can also modify files and so on. And that's where, I didn't mention it, but the command that we're using on IGEL operating system are mostly Linux, I would say, standard commands, besides that ones which are used to configure the device, which are really IGEL ones. But most commands like vi, ls, whoami, cd, mv for moving files, or cp for compiling files, all that stuff is included by default, so you don't have to tweak around. So the first thing that you have to do, and obviously to see that command, is to access the terminal. That's what we covered just in the first section. So you just have to assign a profile or go to the IGEL setup and add the terminal. This terminal is then starting, and you have to enter your root password if set, or if nothing is set, just put enter, and then you are connected. Okay. And that's it. If you want to verify which user you are at the moment, there is a command which is called who am I in one word, which will tell you which user is connected at the moment. I just opened the video on my side, Patrick. It's about minute 2. If you want to go back for a second, because that's a command which might help if you have a lot of comments happening in the background and happening on the screen, and exactly that one. No, just a little bit on 220, and 220. If you can hit 224.
So you're using the who am I command here to just validate you are who you think you are. In my old school days, Linux, Unix, I would usually put in the path display the who am I information, and you can kind of tell it here. I mean, it says root at whatever, which kind of tells you as well.
Exactly. So that just to prove and to show the listener that we are logged in as a root user and everything is done right. So what I did then is to cover the other way to access a terminal. It's a pretty easy one, which is enabled by default, which in my opinion can be a little bit tricky. It's the console switching. So if you go to an IGEL operating system and you put Control Alt and F12 or F11, you can switch from the graphical user interface to a workspace which is called command line. And then you can just switch the console. It's mostly available on every Linux distribution, sometimes activated by default, sometimes not. But you're just switching from the graphical user interface, just kind of moved away from the screen, and the command line is moving on the front.
So Seb, that's in from what I can see here, it's enabled by default.
Yeah.
You are disabling it here. Is that true?
That's a security feature that I'm telling every customer doing when I was in pre-sales. Please do so, because sometimes you have a specific program in your VDI or terminal server where you have a hotkey to press. And if the user is hitting Control Alt and F12, he will find himself in the command line and will not know what to do and how to come back. Yeah. That's the reason why there is a usability question, and then we have a security question that not everyone is knowing that setting a password is the right thing to do, and so on.
Yeah, I've got my 36-inch, 34-inch LG all-in-one right there. I'm doing it.
Yay.
I'm playing while I got to talk to my IGEL systems administrator.
This is the shoemaker's kid shoes right there. You know,
right.
On all of our security assessments, I tell people to disable it, but on yours, it's enabled. So
Seb, right now you've showed how to let's see, enable a terminal session. You're disabling here the hot switching into a terminal session, which was there all along. I just didn't know it because of the graphical. Okay, and then let's keep going.
Just to give you maybe the hotkey to get back to the graphical user interface, because it's not such easy if you don't know how to do it. It's Control Alt and F1.
Okay. Yeah, I just did
it. Is it working? Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
No, just to say, even if your user is doing that by mistake, Control Alt F1 will bring him back to the graphic user interface. That's pretty easy. But that's how sometimes it's extremely easy also to check in which step a device is not starting or a device is not working like expected. So let's imagine that you have a device which boots up. After the boot splash, the device stays black. If you have set that feature still enabled, you can switch to Control Alt and F10, and that will show you the D message, obviously all the different steps that are done during the boot process. And you would see that, I don't know, the device is hanging on network negotiation or on graphical user interface driver detection, whatever. Just saying that if you are not disabling that, or if you want to look at a specific feature that is not working, it might be a good idea to re-enable it and check Control Alt and F10 to see where the device is hanging.
Okay. If nothing else, just to impress your friends.
Sorry?
If nothing else, just to impress the people, impress your friends.
Yeah, exactly. Looks like the Matrix a little bit. So you are feeling like Neo in Matrix.
Yep.
So yeah, that's what I tried to explain on the user interface. So just to cover the key for those of you who are not looking at the video, if you go to user interface, display access control in your profile, you can check a checkbox which is called disable console switching. And that's exactly the topic that we just covered. Then you will not be able to switch back anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a really big deal, but just wanted to share that. So we covered now the way how to get to the command line from the endpoint perspective. But sometimes you don't have an access to the device because the device is, I don't know, connected via ICG or is maybe on a remote office or whatever. So that's the point where you can use different kind of remote accessing to the device. And we are speaking about two, I will not say two different protocols, but two different ways to access this, the terminal. We have built in since, I would have to lie, it was mid OS 10, I guess, when we introduced the secure terminal feature. So I'm not an expert in terms of protocol, but we're routing the SSH tunnel via a telnet port, if I remember right. And that's where you give the ability to access the local shell from the UMS without having the need to start any kind of separate client or whatever. And that's what I'm covering now, is how to configure it. So we have a profile to create to enable it. And we have, if you go into your profile to system, remote management, user secure terminal, if I remember right, you have the ability there to activate that feature. And if you made all the different configurations in prior, like setting password for the user, setting a password for the root user, you will then be able to right-click the device then go to, it was remote access, secure terminal, and then you can access the device via command line from the UMS, which is pretty cool if you want to support a user which is having an issue with performance, like an example, and you want to check the task manager, not via the graphic user interface, but via the command line. So that the command which is called top, T-O-P.
So, Seb, that allows you to get the top information from the UMS real time versus having to get the user to tell you, or maybe SSHing in, or in this case, are you actually SSHing in?
It's SSHing in via Telnet. So we are not using the standard SSH port in that moment. We are using a Telnet connection, which is a little bit easier to handle than the SSH. And that's the reason why we are calling it not remote SSH, but remote secure terminal.
Okay.
That's just one way to do that, but it's a way also you can use over the ICG. Because if you think about the IGEL Cloud Gateway on a device which is somewhere, I don't know, over the world, and the user is just connected to the internet, SSH will not work. That's the reason why we are routing also the secure terminal via ICG. And that's, in my opinion, a good alternative to SSH if you are not in the same company or in the same network segment.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, that's great. That gives us a lot of background on how to set it up and why to use it. Seb, have we done a podcast where we just talked about, like the top 10 command line commands that you see people using? Have we done something like that? I can't remember.
Could be an idea that we speak about the IGEL OS cheat sheet for the next time. Yeah, that's a great idea.
So on that topic, what are the top 5 things that for a real world use case, you've had to break out the command line for?
I would say that the main one that I'm using which is called LN, for linking and creating symbolic links, because that's a base for everything that you do in IGEL OS. So that's where you're creating custom partitions, you're creating symbolic links. If you want to make configuration persistent, you're mostly using a file that you're transposing to the operating system and so on. But I would say LN, then you have a command which is called SED. SED is a tool which can manipulate files. Manipulate sounds a little bit negative, but I really mean that it can change specific strings, specific component, can add lines and so on inside a configuration file, which is great, like for the echo canceling on the Citrix Workspace app client, like an example, which was not enabled by default in our operating system, but was enabled by Citrix. So you could create a JSON file which enabled that feature by using SED. Then obviously the command CP for copying files from one point to another. And honestly, from a pure debugging perspective, netstat is one of my favorite commands, just to monitor and to understand which data is processed over which port in which state, because that's something which is extremely helpful if you want to understand why your device is not getting configuration, if the device is not able to speak to the UMS. And the last one, and that's my top 5, I would also speak about the command which is called journal CTL, which is, I would call it the event viewer of Windows, where you can monitor everything since last boot. Everything in prior is usually deleted by the rebooting process, but you can then look at everything which is happening in which state, and if you have a device which is not working, looking at the recognition is not working, or if there is another reason. So that would be my top 5. There are way more, especially in the IGEL ecosystem, but that's something that we should definitely take that one for the next topic. I will write it down for the next podcast.
Yeah, Patrick.
I was going to say that. Top 3. I mean, I would say a lot of the time when I'm, troubleshooting the basic stuff, there's a few commands that come to mind right away. One is obviously being able to, change, do the basics, get into a terminal, CD is change directory, right? You're going to where so learning the IGEL directory is useful, and then using the command CD, you're going to use that probably more than anyone. And then of course, CAT is to read certain files. So you're going to use CAT to read, your syslog files, all the different logging files for certain applications you may want it to use. So that's probably the second most used that I use. And the other one, and I thought you were going here, Seb, is probe port, which is a My understanding is an IGEL specific command, but it's so useful, especially when you're troubleshooting a brand new IGEL install. So, on the pre-sale side, if the customer is, implementing their own UMS, or on the consulting side, if you're going in with a production style UMS, a lot of times what you'll find is certain ports are not open. So obviously from the server side, you can always use something like telnet to an IGEL endpoint and say, hey, is this port open between here? From the IGEL endpoint side, there's this great command called probe port. So you would do all one word, probe port, and then the IP address of your UMS server, space, and the port number. So 8443, 30,022, whatever ports you want to test. It's a really great way to quickly test it, and it'll tell you right there, hey, it's either it's refused or it's successful. That's probably one of the most used commands that I've used over the years. That's not it's just so useful, and it's a real quick way to say, hey, look, this port is closed. We can prove it. And then they go back to their InfoSec or network guys and get it opened up.
I'm sitting here typing some of these in as you go through them. I don't know. There's moments in my life I wish I'd have been an auto mechanic or just stayed in tech and just, stayed on the Unix path I was on a long time ago. And I don't know. It's just like a lot of fun. Just like it's like a puzzle every day trying to figure stuff out.
Yep.
Well, Seb, thanks for covering this with us. Anything that we didn't bring up that you want to make sure we cover before we let you go?
Just maybe one last thing. We just covered the secure terminal, just saying that you can obviously activate both. So if you want to use SSH, you can use it in parallel to the secure terminal. So you can use both kind of access ways. It's always a good recommendation to set an administrator password. I cannot repeat it enough, because if you don't do that, you can also connect via SSH if you set a specific checkbox. So it's a little bit insecure, but we already meant that in the configuration, so you can't connect via SSH if there is no root password set. So if you're trying to use SSH, please first set an administrator password. And no, that's it.
Yeah. Don't put a back door on the house if you don't put a lock on the back door. Yeah. All right, Patrick. I know you got a workshop coming up. This week, maybe today, maybe tomorrow. I'm not sure what's going on with that.
So it's this Thursday. It's going to be 12 p.m. Eastern. We do have limited capacity. I actually have to check this morning. If you're listening to this and you want to join and it's full, definitely reach out to us. We'll probably get you in there. But we're going to be covering all of the different unified communication technologies. Namely, when you talk about Zoom, Teams, WebEx, the ones that are built in. We'll talk about some of the others. You have Ring Central kind of in the mix there. And we're just, we like to keep these workshops more technical. So we kind of go into the weeds, we lay it out at a high level, and then we go into the settings. And it's been a lot of fun. We've had a lot of guys from the IGEL community joining, having some pretty fun comments going back and forth as we're going through it. We like to geek out a little bit. So it's definitely more of a technical audience. If you're a sysadmin engineer type, definitely encourage you. But it's funny, we do have some CIO type guys that have been joining regularly that are more technical, and they seem to really love it. So having a lot of fun with it. So this Thursday, 12 p.m. Eastern, and of course on our website, XenTegra.com, you can find more information and sign up and register.
Yeah, it's not a one and done, right? We do something like this pretty much every month.
Every month, yep. We've been doing it monthly and really having a lot of fun with it.
Sounds great.
All right. Seb, you coming over for any of the disrupts here in the US?
I don't think so at the moment. I'm planned for Munich, which is basically in Germany itself, so it's not a big deal. Mm-hmm. But for the rest, no. For the moment, I'm really afraid to say that I would not be there, but we'll try to cover the community perspective as best as we can with our members and with the marketing team, which will be on site. So I wish you a lot of fun there, but I can't attend this year.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll see you sometime early next year then.
Hopefully then, yes.
Maybe I'll make it over there. My goal is to get over there. I can't believe I haven't done it yet. I mean, pandemic really caused the...
Or introducing the joy to drink gin and tonic.
I think XenTegra should invade Munich. Well, maybe invades not the right word there. That sounds a little hostile. But the funny story, the only time I've gone to Germany when I was at IGEL, I had my son was born one year. And then of course the 1 year I planned I'm going to go, I'm going to see Munich, I'm going to see all these things. I took a melatonin on the plane to reset myself. And all of us got there. It was like 6 a.m. German time. I went back to the hotel. I'm like, I'm just going to rest my head for a minute. And I crashed, basically fell asleep all day, and didn't get to see anything other than the grocery store across from the hotel. So that was the extent of my tourism. So I want to get back there.
Please, we would happy to welcome you.
Very good. XenTegra invades Munich.com. That's going to be our.
Well, Patrick, let's visit it. Let's don't invade it.
There you go.
All right, gentlemen. We'll do it again in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Well,
all right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.